Shalom Aleichem. Maybe you clicked on this video without thinking too much about it. Maybe it just appeared on your screen while you were scrolling. Or maybe you opened YouTube because the silence in your house has been feeling heavier lately. But let me ask you something honestly before you go any further. Have you ever wondered why so many people say they believe in Jesus and yet their hearts feel cold when they hear his name? Why is it that we can hear the story of the cross 1,000 times and still feel almost nothing? Why do some people hear about Jesus and their eyes fill with tears, while others hear the same words and feel absolutely nothing inside? The problem is not that human beings are incapable of love. The real problem is that most of us do not truly understand what happened on that cross. We know the story, but we have never truly seen it. And until the day comes when a person actually understands what Jesus did for them, the heart remains locked like a door with rusted hinges. You see, love for Christ is not something that a preacher can force into your heart. It is not something you can manufacture with effort, discipline, or religious routines. Love for Christ is what happens when the truth finally breaks through the fog that covers the human soul. It is like a fire that suddenly ignites in dry wood. But for many people, that fire never starts because the cross has become too familiar. It has become a symbol on a necklace, a decoration on a wall, a word repeated in churches until it loses its weight. And the tragedy is that millions of people believe they understand the cross when in reality they have only heard about it from a distance. Let me speak to you with honesty for a moment. Many of us grew up with fathers who were distant, cold, or absent. Some people listening to this video were abandoned. Others were raised in homes where affection was rare and compassion even rarer. And because of that, love can feel like a language we were never taught to speak. There are people who say they want to love God, but their hearts feel empty, like a well that has run dry. Some people can easily feel compassion for animals, for strangers, for stories they see on the news. But when it comes to God, their hearts feel strangely numb. If that is you, do not feel ashamed. You are not the only one. There are people who spent years studying philosophy, searching through religions, reading books, exploring spiritual paths, calling themselves seekers of truth, only to realize later that their search was often filled with pride. There are doctors, professors, intelligent people who spent their lives believing they understood everything, only to discover that the human heart can be more blind than the human mind. Some people only begin to understand when life breaks them. Sometimes it is sickness, sometimes it is loss, sometimes it is the moment when everything we built with our own hands suddenly collapses and we are forced to admit that we are far more fragile than we ever imagined. It is often in that moment, when the noise of our pride finally becomes silent, that the soul begins to ask the question it avoided for years. Why would Jesus give his life for someone like me? And that question, if you are brave enough to face it honestly, has the power to change everything about the way you see your life, your past, your pain, and your future. Because when a person truly understands what happened on that cross, love is no longer something you try to produce. It becomes the only possible response. But before we can understand the love of Christ, we must first look at something that the modern world desperately tries to avoid. We must look at the true condition of the human heart. The modern world has trained us to think about ourselves in very comfortable ways. We like to believe that human beings are basically good, that our mistakes are small, that our failures are understandable, and that God, if he exists at all, must surely overlook most of what we do. Many people imagine God almost like a kind grandfather in the sky, someone who smiles gently at human weakness and eventually lets everyone into heaven because, after all, nobody is perfect. But the God of the Scriptures is not a sentimental idea created to comfort the human ego. The God of the Bible is described as holy, not once, not twice, but 3 times holy. And that word holy means something far deeper than moral correctness. It means absolute purity, absolute justice, absolute truth. Now place the human heart next to that kind of holiness, and suddenly the comfortable illusion begins to crack. Because the problem with humanity is not simply that we sometimes make mistakes. The deeper problem is that the human heart has a natural tendency to live as if God were not the king of the universe. From the moment we learn to speak, we learn to say the word mine, my desires, my plans, my ambitions, my pleasure, my life. We take the gifts that God has given us, our breath, our minds, our abilities, and we use them to build little kingdoms centered around ourselves. Imagine for a moment a man who owes a debt so large that not even 10 generations of his family could ever repay it. Imagine that this man has been brought before a righteous king, a king whose laws cannot be ignored and whose justice cannot be bribed. The man stands there with empty hands. His clothes are torn, his record is stained with betrayal, and the sentence has already been pronounced. He knows that he cannot buy his freedom. He knows that he cannot negotiate his way out of the consequences. All he can do is stand there waiting for the day when the punishment will finally fall. That picture, uncomfortable as it may be, is closer to the human condition than most people are willing to admit. Because when we speak about sin, we are not simply talking about breaking a rule. Sin is the quiet rebellion of the human heart against the authority of its creator. Every lie, every act of cruelty, every moment of selfishness, every hidden thought that we hope no one will ever discover, all of it reveals something about the condition of our souls. And if the story ended there, it would be a story of despair, because a debt against an infinite God cannot be repaid by finite creatures. Charity cannot erase it. Religious rituals cannot erase it. Good intentions cannot erase it. The modern mind struggles with this idea because we prefer to believe that we can slowly improve ourselves until we become acceptable to God. We imagine that life is like climbing a ladder, one moral step at a time, until we eventually reach heaven by our own effort. But the Scriptures present a very different picture. They say that the ladder was never something we could climb in the first place. The distance between human rebellion and divine holiness is too great. And that is exactly where the astonishing message of the gospel begins to unfold. Because when humanity stood spiritually bankrupt, when the debt was impossible to pay and the verdict was already written, the king did something no one expected. The king did not remain safely on his throne, sending orders of judgment from a distance. Instead, the king himself stepped down into the very world that had rebelled against him. He laid aside the visible glory of heaven and entered the broken story of humanity, not as a conqueror surrounded by armies, but as a child born in obscurity. This is the part of the story that many people know, but very few truly stop to consider. Because the moment God entered the world in the person of Jesus, history itself began moving toward a single hill outside the city of Jerusalem. place where the weight of human guilt and the depth of divine love would collide in a way the universe had never witnessed before. Now follow the story carefully, because this is the moment where everything begins to change. When Jesus walked the earth, he did not live the kind of life that powerful men usually choose. He did not build palaces. He did not gather armies. He did not use his authority to crush his enemies. Instead, he walked among the broken. He touched lepers that everyone else avoided. He spoke to people that society had already judged and rejected. He opened the eyes of the blind. He healed the sick. He forgave the guilty. Every step of his life revealed something about the heart of God. But the same world that benefits from grace often resists truth, because the light that exposes darkness is rarely welcomed by those who prefer to hide. Slowly, the tension around Jesus began to grow. Religious leaders felt threatened by his authority. Political powers feared the influence he had over the people. And the crowd that once admired him was easily manipulated by voices that demanded his silence. Yet none of this surprised him. Jesus knew exactly where his path was leading. The night before the crucifixion, he went to a place called Gethsemane, a quiet garden where olive trees had stood for generations. This was not a public moment. No crowds, no sermons, no miracles, just silence, darkness, and the weight of what was about to happen. The scriptures tell us that something astonishing occurred there. Jesus began to sweat drops like blood. Think about that for a moment. The one who had calmed storms with a word, the one who had raised the dead, the one whose voice carried the authority of heaven itself, now trembled under a burden so heavy that the human mind struggles to grasp it. Some people assume that Jesus was simply afraid of physical pain, but history tells us that thousands of men have faced death with courage on battlefields and in prisons. The suffering of the cross was brutal, yes, but the deeper agony was something far more profound. In that garden, Jesus was looking directly into what the scriptures call the cup of God's justice. Imagine the total weight of human rebellion throughout history, every lie ever spoken, every act of cruelty, every hidden corruption of the heart, every injustice committed in secret places, all of it gathered together like a storm cloud of moral darkness. And in that moment, the one who had never known sin was preparing to stand in the place of sinners. This is the mystery at the center of the gospel. Jesus did not simply come to teach good ideas about morality. He came to take the place that belonged to us. Every accusation that could be raised against humanity was about to fall on him. Every consequence that justice demanded was about to strike him instead. The Garden of Gethsemane was the moment when the cost of that mission became fully visible. And yet, despite the terror of that cup, Jesus spoke words that reveal the depth of his love. He said, "Not my will, but yours be done." Those words changed the direction of history, because from that moment forward, the path led directly to the trials, the humiliation, and the hill called Golgotha. The Son of God would soon stand before human courts, falsely accused by the very people he came to save. He would be mocked, struck, and spat upon by soldiers who had no idea that the one standing silently before them was the same voice that had spoken the universe into existence. And still he did not turn away, because the cross was never an accident. It was the moment when divine love chose to carry the full weight of human guilt. And then we arrive at the hill called Golgotha, the place the scriptures describe as the place of the skull. History has witnessed many executions, many wars, many acts of cruelty, but nothing that has ever happened on this earth can truly be compared to what took place there when the soldiers laid the wooden beam on the ground and forced Jesus onto it. They were carrying out what they believed was just another routine execution. To them, he was just another condemned man, another rebel, another name that would disappear into the long list of those the Roman Empire had crushed. They took the nails and drove them through his hands, the same hands that had touched the sick and restored their health. They lifted the cross upright, letting the full weight of his body hang against the wounds. But here is something many people misunderstand. It was not the nails that kept Jesus on that cross. If the Son of God had chosen to step down in that moment, the soldiers could not have stopped him. The forces of heaven stood ready, and with a single command, legions of angels could have ended the entire scene. The reason he remained there was not weakness, it was love. And as the hours passed, something even more mysterious began to unfold. Darkness fell across the land, not the kind of darkness caused by clouds or by an eclipse, but a darkness that seemed to reflect the gravity of what was happening in the spiritual realm. This was the moment when justice and mercy met in a way that no human mind could fully measure. The one who had never committed sin was now bearing the consequences of sin. Every lie, every betrayal, every selfish act that humanity had ever produced was being laid upon him. This is why the cry that came from the cross echoes through history with such haunting power. My God, why have you forsaken me?" In that cry, we hear something that goes beyond physical suffering. We hear the cost of redemption, because what Jesus was experiencing in that moment was the separation that sin creates between humanity and God. The judgment that justice required was falling upon him instead of upon us. Imagine standing before a judge knowing that the sentence you deserve is unavoidable, and then suddenly someone else steps forward and says, "I will take the punishment in his place." That is the heart of the gospel. The sword of divine justice was raised, and when it fell, it did not strike the guilty. It struck the innocent substitute who had willingly stepped between justice and the human soul. And when the final moment arrived, Jesus spoke words that changed everything forever. "It is finished." Those words were not the cry of defeat. They were the declaration that the debt had been fully paid, not postponed, not reduced, paid in full. The price of redemption had been written not in ink, but in blood. The barrier between a holy God and sinful humanity had been opened by the sacrifice of the Son. And yet, even after hearing this story, many people still struggle with the same question. Why do I still feel distant from God? Why does my heart still feel cold? The answer often lies in where we are looking. Many people spend their lives looking inward, examining their own failures, measuring their spiritual progress, trying to climb their way toward God through effort and discipline. But love for Christ does not grow by staring at our own weakness. Love grows when we finally lift our eyes and look at the cross long enough to understand what it truly means. This is where everything begins to change inside a human heart. Because the moment a person truly understands what happened on that cross, the entire way they see life starts to shift. Suddenly the question is no longer, how can I prove myself worthy of God, but how could someone love me enough to take my place? And that realization breaks something deep inside the soul. Pride begins to collapse. The illusion that we are strong, self-sufficient, and in control starts to crumble. The heart that once felt cold begins to soften in a way that cannot be explained by logic alone. This is why so many people who hear the message of the cross suddenly find themselves weeping without fully understanding why. It is not simply emotion. It is the human soul finally recognizing the depth of a love it never deserved. Think about the people who have shared their stories, people who spend years chasing money, pleasure, success, and power only to discover that none of those things could fill the emptiness inside them. Others who carried shame from mistakes they believed could never be forgiven. Some were proud intellectuals who studied philosophy and religion, searching for answers, convinced they could find truth through knowledge alone. Some were broken by sickness, by loss, by the sudden realization that life is fragile and time is short. And in those moments when the noise of the world finally quiets down, the cross begins to speak in a way that no argument ever could. It says you are more sinful than you ever dared to admit, but you are also more loved than you ever dared to hope. This is the paradox at the center of the gospel. The cross exposes the darkness of the human heart while revealing the immeasurable mercy of God at the same time. And when that truth finally settles into a person's soul, love for Christ stops being a religious duty. It becomes gratitude. It becomes the response of a drowning man who has been pulled out of the ocean by someone who risked everything to save him. Suddenly sin begins to look different. It no longer feels attractive, not because someone threatened you with punishment, but because you realize that every act of rebellion was part of the weight that Jesus carried to the cross. The things that once seemed harmless now appear as the very nails that pierce the hands of the one who loved you first. And at the same time, suffering begins to look different as well. Because if the Son of God was willing to endure the cross for your redemption, then even the painful chapters of your life cannot be meaningless. The one who conquered death is also able to redeem the broken pieces of your story, and the story did not end with a sealed tomb. 3 days after the crucifixion, something happened that changed the course of history forever. The grave could not hold him. Death itself was defeated. The resurrection is the declaration that the sacrifice was accepted and that the victory of Christ is not a memory of the past, but a living reality. Jesus is not simply a historical figure who once died for sinners. He is alive, and because he lives, the invitation of the gospel is still open today. Many people know the facts of this story with their minds, but they have never allowed it to reach their hearts. They know about Jesus, but they have never truly looked at him. And so I want to leave you with a question that you should not answer too quickly. It is not the question of whether you attend church or whether you consider yourself a good person or whether you know the teachings of the Bible. The real question is this: have you truly understood what Jesus did for you? Because the moment that truth finally reaches the deepest part of your soul, love will no longer be something you try to produce. It will become the natural response of a heart that has finally seen the cross. Look at him. Look at the one who carried your guilt, who endured your judgment, who opened the door of mercy with his own blood. And when you truly see him, you will discover that loving him is no longer difficult. It becomes the most natural thing your soul has ever known.